This is football. Mike Tannenbaum joins me for an incredible discussion, mostly focused on going around the league, but we also do some early 2010s Jets talk that everybody's going to enjoy, not just Jets fans, but everybody. Rex Ryan also some Belichick sauna talk just a couple weeks after some Bill Parcells sauna talk from Channing Crowder. This is your home for legendary coaches in the sauna anecdotes. Okay, very quickly, I want to get to Mike here, but I want to address Monday night's disaster for the New York Giants, which we're getting, and everybody saw the numbers through the first two home games, historic levels of incompetence. It's sad for a franchise that I thought was on the right track coming into this season, even with Daniel Jones' contract. There's all sorts of bad quarterback contracts around football. I didn't think, I still don't think that contract is going to sink the franchise. It hasn't. That's not the reason that the Giants are this bad. The reason is, first of all, Evan Neal is one of the worst draft picks I've ever seen. I was in my brain, I was like, well, do I say 5 years, decade? Like, he can't play. And going from, he obviously played at he was a top recruit, played at a huge program. The idea he would get to this level and be incapable of playing well, and I'm sorry, let me back up, incapable of stopping anybody. Like, the only reason that he ever stopped anybody was because somebody else got through last night and ended the play before Evan Neal could screw it up. And then you have the interior of the line was awful. And obviously, listen, that was not a finished product. They've had injuries, all that stuff. But this is a bad roster that thought that they had it. And that's the difference between, let's say, the Giants and the Bears, is that the Giants thought they were crushing it. Right? Like, that's the problem. And it gets towards something, and I said this at the beginning, I think it was maybe in the first or second episode of the show, which is someone smart said the Giants and the Vikings had the same problem, which is they won more games than their roster should have last year. And the difference is the Vikings said, okay, we'll do a soft rebuild. We had a great year last year. Let's figure it out. And the Giants said, let's pay our quarterback $82 million guaranteed. Let's lock in. Let's stay at the course. This goes to something I hate, and the Giants fell for it. Stability for the sake of stability. Not stability because you're on the right track, but stability because you want to say, well, that's settled, and just kind of just throw your hands together and say, okay, good, great, grand, we have a quarterback, time to get to work. You didn't have a quarterback. You never had a quarterback. You looked good because he was able to make better plays than what the circumstances dictated last year. They didn't have any wide receivers. Their offensive line was still bad last year. He was able to make plays. It doesn't mean you give him $40 million a year. It doesn't mean you give him $82 million guaranteed. It doesn't mean you get into a position where you can't pay other players, including Mike Tannenbaum talks about Saquon Barkley a little bit later, including a guy who seems like, even though he's a running back, even though he's had ups and downs as a Giant, he is the heartbeat of that team. We're seeing that now. There's no better viral advertisement for Saquon Barkley than what we saw on Monday night, because he could have at least relieved some of the pressure. But it goes back to, and I've said this before, but the stability thing reminds me of when the Commanders, the Washington football team back then, signed Alex Smith, traded for Alex Smith and signed that huge deal, if you remember. And I remember talking to somebody, and I was like, what is the point of this? Letting Kirk Cousins walk, getting Alex Smith, giving him huge money, just as you would have had to do with Kirk Cousins. Well, we just want stability here because the quarterback's just been such a huge question mark for so many years. And it's like, well, first of all, who provided that question mark? You did. The Commanders did. But then second of all, stability is overrated when it's not the answer. Locking yourself into the wrong answer is worse than having no answer at all. The Alex Smith thing obviously got off to the wrong track. It was hard to judge. He got injured, all that stuff. But it just shows you, just because you have a plan doesn't mean it's a good plan. Don't confuse planning with being smart. Okay? And everybody does all the time. Hey, what's the plan? What's the plan? Do we have to have the plan? And that's part of the problem. And I've talked to guys about this throughout the league. Part of the problem is that owners come to the GM and the coach and say, what's our plan at quarterback? And if you don't have one, you get fired. You don't have one, you get fired. And I'm not saying that's going to happen in Atlanta, but right now, Atlanta came into the season with Desmond Ridder and said, that's our plan. And God bless them, they didn't overcommit to somebody who was worse, or give a bunch of money to someone like Desmond Ridder, a Ridder type of player, didn't give a bunch of money to him. It's a low commitment there. But they, obviously thought that he was the answer. They planned towards that. They built a season around it. It's not going to work. But anyway, I don't want to keep doing the Falcons. I do want to do the Giants. I got to say, I think Brian Daboll is a good coach, but I also think that when you watch the Giants, they look alarmingly poorly coached. How do I reckon with that? I just ignore it and continue to think Brian Daboll is a good coach and blame somebody else. In this case, the line, Daniel Jones, and then at some point down the line, when all else has failed, Joe Shane before that, I'll blame Brian Daboll. But it's getting there. We're getting to that point because at some point you watch this Giants team and you say, everybody's at fault. Everybody. Daniel Jones is in a weird zone where he's not good, but he deserves better than this. He deserves to not get hit every time he takes a first step drop. He deserves, and again, I don't want to give him too much grace because I think that if he was given more time, we would just see some of the more poor decision-making we saw last night. But this team is broken right now. And unfortunately, they're not designed to be unbroken anytime soon. That's why you don't commit to stability for the sake of stability. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Tannenbaum. Tickets to the game, merch, meals at iconic restaurants, stays at Caesar's Palace. All this can be yours when you bet with Caesar Sportsbook. Win or lose, every bet earns reward credits, which you can redeem across the empire. Now, if you haven't started yet, use the code OMAHAFULL and then place your first bet up to $1,250. If you win, great, you keep those winnings. But if you lose, you get your stake back as a bonus bet. All right, Mike Tannenbaum's here, ESPN analyst, longtime NFL executive. And I told him to pause, he just had some baby advice. Teddy is now almost 9 months old. He just had some baby advice that was given to him from Mr. Bill Parcells. Mike, you have the floor.
Kevin, first of all, it's great to be with you, and congratulations on Teddy and your roster addition. That's always a incredible moment in our lives. Now, being a dad, however, doesn't mean you have to be changing diapers. And when we had our daughter, I was at the Jets, and Coach Parcells just gave me great wisdom that certainly still applies to you, which is, as new dads, if we change a diaper that is as leaky as possible, it's going to be the last diaper you ever have to change. Because my wife, like yours, will be like, "Oh, I'll handle it. You're not very good at that," and then you never have to change another diaper.
Set the standard. Wow, wise words from a sage and Bill Parcells. Let's get to football, Mike. If you were, and this is so hypothetical because the Crafts would never do this, but if you were put in charge of the Patriots today, October 3rd, this week, and you have to have a conversation about Bill Belichick about his future, you tell Bill Belichick what right now off of Sunday's game?
Don't change. I had the privilege of working for Coach Belichick twice in my career, and I will tell you that he's the harshest critic on himself of anybody. He's a thought leader. He's has his views, but he's not dogmatic. And I would just tell him, don't change. Like what made you what will soon to be the greatest coach in the history of our sport. Don't lose that mindset. Keep the standards, and trust your gut, trust your judgment, and we're here to help. But we believe in you.
Do you think obviously things get better from one of the worst losses we've ever seen from a Belichick team, but do you think roster-wise there's a path forward for this team where they actually compete for playoff spots consistently the next 2-3 years?
Yeah, absolutely. There's working for Coach Parcells and Coach Belichick, when we weren't talking about how to change diapers and we were talking about football, there's something that really applies here to the Patriots, which is there's a lot of different ways to control the game. And if you look at what New England does have for a minute, and we'll get to what they don't, but what they do have is a really good defense. Now, look, if Matthew Judon is out for a considerable amount of time, which reportedly as of today, it sounds like he will be, but they have a great defense, or certainly a very good defense. They have two outstanding tight ends in Hunter Henry and Mike Gesicki. They have a very good running back in Ramondre Stevenson. And they used to have a quarterback that was smart and dependable, who a lot of us thought could be sort of like Matt Ryan-ish. So how do we win games knowing that there's teams out there like the Kansas City Roar that can put up a lot of points? we can't beat ourselves. Coach Belichick has always talked about that, Kevin. We can't beat ourselves. Teams will lose games way more than we have to win it. That clearly didn't happen against Dallas, and that can never happen again. So Mac Jones, you have to make consistently good decisions for us to win because we don't have the same margin that other teams do. They need to continue to add explosive elements to this offense. I think Pop Douglas is certainly going to be one of those. I think they can make explosive plays with their tight ends, and they're going to need to add somebody, at some point. I broadcast the Jet Patriot game with Steve Levy, Kevin, and, the most explosive play came out of 3 tight ends with Pharaoh Brown and, Sauce Gardner dropped the coverage. So you're not going to make a living doing that, but I think they're closer to being meaningfully competitive than some of the reports out there saying that it's over, because that's just not true. They have a lot of good pieces. They have a lot of good pieces on offense. They're not perfect. They probably could use a little bit more juice on the outside, but you give me a roster and I'll tell you the holes they have. Nobody has a perfect team.
But at the end of this season, who's the best team in football? Because I was going to ask you, because I think it's reductive to say, okay, we just saw the Bills versus the Dolphins. Those two teams had an argument going into Sunday. The Bills have a lead right now. But after we're sitting here on January 10th or whenever the playoffs start, we're saying who is the best team in football, Mike?
Oof. Probably Kansas City, but
yeah,
they showed some vulnerabilities the other night, in the cap system, Kevin. I would say San Francisco, but look, Brock Purdy's a good player. They're in that conversation. I don't think Philly looks the same. Dallas obviously losing Trayvon Diggs, although Deron Bland's played well. Josh Allen, when he's playing like he did on Sunday, they're going to be hard to beat, but losing Tre'Davious White, it's funny because Deron Bland's going to have to replace Diggs just the way Kaiir Elam's going to have to replace Tre'Davious White. And Kaiir Elam was a first-round pick who was a healthy scratch on Sunday. So, you tell me the team, and like I said, they all have issues they got to work through.
Speaking of, let's go through and fix some franchises. And we're going to start with the team that needs a lot of fixing right now because Monday night was unbelievable to me. And they gave up Daniel Jones, obviously, the contract, and the numbers are buzzy. There are outs in that contract. I think it was $82 million guaranteed. I think people saw the 160 and their eyes got big, but it really is essentially what amounts to a 2-year guaranteed type of deal. But this roster needs a lot of work. They're not totally healthy, but this was a game where you just start to question everything. If you're put in charge of the Giants tomorrow, you start where?
I make Saquon Barkley. I can't get his deal done until after the season if I get him signed. He's your best player. I think there's too much dogmatic conversation around it's the running back. No,
yeah,
Saquon Barkley is a great player, like the way Bijan Robinson is. It was interesting. I know Tom Herman very well, and Tom Herman's now the head coach at FAU. He recruited Bijan Robinson at Texas, and they played him a lot in the slot. Saquon Barkley changes games. They paid the wrong guy. If you told me I could have Riley Leonard or Daniel Jones, I'm taking Riley Leonard. I think there's a ceiling on Daniel Jones, and I think candidly they paid the wrong player.
What do you do now? Is there anything you can do now? I mean, other than a time machine, it just feels like you just kind of take your medicine and let the contract get told until you can get out of it, right?
Yeah, and I would keep scouring. Next year there's gonna be a lot of quarterbacks in the draft. Yep. The Kevin right now, certainly the headlines is the Caleb Williams of the world, but there's gonna be probably 5 or 6 first round quarterbacks. We talk about Penix and Quinn Ewers and Riley Leonard.
Yeah.
If I'm them, I'm drafting a quarterback. Because I think when you put Daniel Jones in the pocket and you rush him to keep him in the pocket, he's an average player. His biggest plays are outside the pocket. I think Evan Neal is somebody that, unless his foot quickness changes dramatically, he's either going to have to move inside the guard or they're going to have to move on from him. That's hard to do when he was just, taken, last year in the top 10. But, you look at Mekhi Becton and Evan Neal, their lack of foot quickness is killing them.
Yeah, no, I cannot believe how bad Evan Neal is. I cannot believe it looks like, and it's just obviously it's so pronounced because when it's a tackle, you can just see guys blowing past him. But I'm not sure I've ever seen a top 10 pick look that bad in his second year. And maybe I'm totally blanking on something, but obviously quarterbacks aside, because we've seen Zach Wilson struggle and all that stuff. But I was blown away by how bad Neal was the other night. Same question about the Bears. This is a team that had lower expectations, certainly, but there are people in the league who still say Ryan Poles is on the right track. Maybe Eberflus is not. But when you look at this team, Is there any optimistic case right now if you're a Bears fan, Mike?
Yeah, I was on record. I would have taken, Bryce Young. I like Justin
Yeah.
Fields. He played great for 3 quarters, in fairness to him, on Sunday. Um, Look, it's easy to say, like, don't trade Chase Claypool for the 33rd pick. Look, I would just say this, like, JC Jackson signing with the Chargers, or Mike Tomlin. Like, Mike Tomlin and Bill Belichick are not going to trade young, selfless, high character, productive players. Like, they're just not going to do that. Like, when Chase Claypool or JC Jackson's available, there's a reason for it. And I'm not messing around with any of those players that are leaving from those two head coaches. I spent a lot of time studying, like, which coaches and organizations evaluate their own correctly. Those two evaluate their own correctly. I would really put as much resources now into their lines. I think while Darnell Wright's probably going to be a pretty good offensive tackle, not taking Jalen Carter is really going to hurt this franchise, because when you could get quick interior pressure, Kevin, that could cover up for a lot of other deficiencies.
When you mention teams and how they evaluate their own and how they, I guess you could say, self-scout their entire organization, like, what does that entail? Like, what's the difference between a franchise that does a good job and a bad job of that?
So, it's one of those things that, Coach Parcells talked a lot about, relative to, like, team building. Like, so we actually called it the outdoor report, and we would actually evaluate the players that left certain decision makers, and we would see how productive they were. And some just understand how to evaluate their own better. A lot of times, a new head coach or GM will come in with all the answers, and they'll just try to indiscriminately get rid of all the former players. And a lot of times those players could still play, and it creates opportunities. So, and I saw, like, firsthand in 1997, I got hired by Coach Parcells and Belichick. The 96 Jets won 1 game. We won 9. And it came down to coaching and accountability. And a lot of times there's a lot of good players on bad teams. And if you're patient enough to get the most out of them, you can.
What's one thing, and obviously you worked for, we'll start with Parcells, because it was funny. One of the reasons I thought Sean Payton might work this year in Denver, and I didn't think they were going to win 11 games, but they'd be better than they were last year, is because he worked for Coach Parcells, and nobody was better at immediately establishing a culture than Bill Parcells. And maybe it took till year 2 to actually turn around the franchise, but it began in year 1. His Harvard Business Review study, where he basically outlines how he turns around a team, is one of the best football writing I've ever seen, because it's a mixture of honesty. If you read his book, it's just improving special teams, all of that stuff. But working under Bill Parcells, how do you, I know this is a huge question, but, like, the key to turning around a team is what, Mike?
It's pretty simple, actually. It's having expectations, and
Yeah.
when people beat them, they stay, and when they're not, you have to be beholden to that standard and not be afraid of hard conversations. And I know that sounds incredibly simplistic, but I've been around other coaches that can't do that. And if we say the standard is the standard, and whatever that may be, being on time, knowing the plays, being, making your weight, whatever it is, like you're going to stick around. If you don't know what to do, you won't be here. If you're not, like, take Chase Claypool, for example. Like, Chase Claypool has ability. That's very clear, Kevin. But if he's not blocking in the run game, like, we don't want him on the team. If we don't have running backs that are great pass protectors, they're not going to be on our team. Like, we used to write incentives for running backs that they got paid extra money when we were good in the passing game, because we wanted selflessness, and we used economics to engineer that behavior. And I think one of the things that anybody that has ever worked for Coach Parcells or Coach Belichick, like, those are the standards, and they are not compromised, and everyone knows where they stand. I mean, Zach Wilson, albeit he did play better against Kansas City, like, he should have been benched against the Patriots. He wasn't
Right.
playing good enough, and players see that, and they struggle with it, because what happens is, Kevin, they know that the NFL is the ultimate meritocracy. And if you're going to
Right.
bench me, coach, why is he, to a different standard?
It goes back to something, and I was actually looking at this the other night when I was thinking about Zach Wilson a week ago, because when Matt Flynn, if you remember, was supposed to be the starter in Seattle, he got beat up by Russell Wilson. And Pete Carroll, his rationale for naming Russell Wilson as a 3rd-round pick after 1 training camp as the starter, his rationale was that if I don't name the best player available, no one's going to be able to take me seriously ever again when I talk about competition. And for me, like I'm looking at the Jets right now, and again, you mentioned Zach Wilson did play really well on Sunday relative to how he had played, but like if I'm Robert Saleh and I'm looking at all of these great players in my roster across the defense, on the young wide receivers, all of that stuff, Dalvin Cook in the backfield, and they're all saying, well, I'm proving I'm great every single day. Zach Wilson isn't. It seems to me it could start to eat away at the culture of the franchise. Am I wrong, Mike?
No, you're 1,000% correct. That's 100%. It's exactly right. And what Salah has to be careful of, Kevin, is like not what the players are saying, but it's what they're thinking, and it eviscerates. Why does Bill Parcells go to 4 different buildings and make the playoffs? For the very like the standards are the standards, and when Robert Saleh says things at the press conference that no one believes, it really hurts his credibility. And the players know it. Like the players are a great check and balance. Like they see the same thing everybody else sees.
Is there, and I was thinking about this with Arthur Smith in Atlanta the other day, because he was saying that Kyle Pitts doesn't care or Drake doesn't care about not getting the ball. They just want to win, all that stuff. And I'm sitting here thinking they might say that and they might tell the media that, but you don't get paid based on if you're Kyle Pitts, if you're a first round wide receiver, or any of these guys, any of these. I mean, they have 3 really good pass catching targets. You don't get paid based on willingness to help the team win. You get paid based on targets and production and all that stuff. How do you have conversations? How did you have conversations with players in that regard, where it's like, okay, your role might not make you a lot of money, but you got to sacrifice? Like, how did you sort of balance that when you were when you knew you might lose a player who maybe wasn't on track to get a lot of money?
Yep. It's a very fair question. I would go to Kyle Pitts and say, hey, look, here's the deal. Like Arthur Blank's aligned with this. Like we're building a winning team here. And when we win, you're going to get paid, and you're going to get paid really well, because you're going to be, if you're playing and we're winning. And that's why it's really important to reward Saquon Barkley, because
right,
players see that I traded a player early on when I was a GM because he had DUI. And I just felt like when you pay people or don't pay people, that sends a message to your locker room. And I've paid the wrong player more than once. So I'm not saying that, my standard was what we did was perfect. But my point is, like, I would use that actually as an opportunity, Kevin, if I'm Arthur Smith, to quickly pay a player who doesn't have the stats, but is doing everything right, making up a name like a Jonnu Smith.
right.
Jonnu Smith does a lot of jobs that don't show up on the stat sheet, but he's a really, really, really good player. And when you could pay players that don't show up on a stat sheet, that's when you really have, the right thing going on. And I look at a franchise like Baltimore, for example. Every year they're eviscerated by injuries, and every year they keep figuring out a way to win.
Right.
Like they're doing something right. And Devin Duvernay, who was probably an afterthought in the spring because they have OBJ and they sign Nelson Aguilar and they draft Zay Flowers. I'm sure Devin Duvernay went home and had some really tough nights. But guess what? He has a massive opportunity now. And I would be saying, like, you know what, Devin, go be the best blocking wide receiver in the NFL and watch what we do with your contract.
Yeah, no, totally. I think it's really fascinating how it is. You mentioned paying the wrong players. You don't have to answer this, but I'm going to give you the floor. Worst contract you ever gave, and what was the wrong process behind it?
Yep. So we paid a player outside of our building, made him the highest paid player at his position. And that's just something you shouldn't do. Like, you don't want to have the highest paid player at any of your position groups not be from within. It just sends the wrong message. And it was a mistake I made once and would never have made again. Because again, Kevin, if you show up every day and work hard, if you're at the Wall Street Journal or Omaha or the Ringer or wherever you're going to be next.
Sure. Hypothetically, sure.
Hypothetically, right? And you bust your ass and they bring somebody else in and pay them a little bit more. You're like, well, what the F? Like, I show up every day. I have great grammar. I don't, incorrectly conjugate my verbs. There's no iambic pentameter issues with you. So, like, in all seriousness, like, you would be pissed off. They brought somebody in and more money. And I made that mistake and pissed some people off, and they were right and I was wrong.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Bill Belichick is the master at understanding how finances dictate what goes on in the locker room. Am I wrong? Like I've heard stories about basically he understands, like, if I pay this guy more than this guy, the whole thing goes to hell.
Yeah, that's one of his many superpowers.
All right, let's do statute of limitations theater stories you can tell now that you weren't able to in the past. Number one thing we don't know about Bill Belichick that people would surprise people, either from a football perspective or a non-football perspective.
He likes the sauna. He likes going in the sauna. Yeah, I had a lot of good conversations with Coach Belichick in the sauna.
Wow, do you just get in there and just talk about life?
Yeah, and Bill was Bill has a great sense of humor. Bill has, like I wish the one thing people knew about Bill Belichick, like how much he cares deeply about young people. Like,
Yeah,
there was other people involved, Mike Lombardi, Scott Pioli, like, but he gave me an opportunity, like I'll never forget. And he's done that for like a lot of people. And he lived in a beach chair in Detroit when he was a special teams coach. And he paid his dues, Kevin, and it wasn't always easy. I'm not saying it was, but he's given a lot. Like, look at Cleveland, like Jim Schwartz and Eric
yeah.
Mangini and Scott Pioli and George Kokinis, Kirk Ferentz, Nick Saban. I mean, the list, it's legendary. And like, how unbelievably lucky am I, like, to be able to say, like, I work for him, and he knew how to have fun. He knew how to he gave people green game balls, meaning he gave them cash when we won games. He paid people out of his own pocket. Um, he's really a selfless person that cares more. Like, I think he feels, and I hate to speak like that, but he doesn't really think about the media as a way to let people get to know him. He thinks about the
Right.
media as that's part of his job, but there's a side of him that's really special.
Why do you think he doesn't want to show it? And then the second part of this question is, do you think he will show it after he's done?
I hope he does, but you know how, like, you meet people in life and they say, like, I don't really care what people think, but they do.
Right.
I think that's certainly been me at certain times in my life, and I think as I've gotten older, I care less. But he's one of those people, like, he's a great human being who cares deeply about the game, takes his responsibilities very seriously, and really does try to help others. Like, I could tell you the notes and emails and texts I've gotten from him and countless others. And he doesn't really care if, reporter X of, Y newspaper knows that. Like, he's not being fulfilled by, being in a contest that has anything to do with popularity.
I know you mentioned maybe you have cared what people think about you when you're running teams or whatever. How much did you read the media when you were running the Jets and the Dolphins?
Yeah, I would say this, like, I read it less and less as I went along, but your loved ones do read it, and
Right.
they amplify, and then you got to deal with it. And there's not a head coach or GM in the league right now that doesn't read it to some extent. Some read it more than others, but they all know. Like, it's impossible not to know. Like, your barber, everyone's going to have an opinion, and you just try to block it out. And I think where I had success in my career was I always said to myself, like, if I could look to the left and to the right with the head coach and owner, if they're on the same page, I really didn't care what others, like, I knew some decisions weren't going to be popular or whatever, but I thought I did a good job of always communicating with the owner and the head coach to say, hey, if we do this, here's what we can't do from a cap standpoint or a draft standpoint, or, hey, we think our left guard sucks, and if we extend on this linebacker, we're still going to have a left guard that we hate. So let's make sure that we're having that conversation. And I felt like I was good at that. But, like, when you're running a team in New York, like, you can't not have a sense of what's going on because of
Right.
the market.
Right. No, I completely agree. And also the media is just so it's everywhere. Did it get worse or better? Like, beat writers probably have less influence than they did 25 years ago, let's say, because newspapers are not what they were. But now it's tweets, things get taken out of context. The internet and social media have just blown up everything. Like, is it harder to be in football with the way the media is now, or is it easier because newspapers are not a thing anymore?
Well, I don't know. I was always big into the process. I was always big into, like, no shortcuts.
Right.
So I actually liked the scrutiny. I didn't like the loudest voice was going to win, or there was,
Right.
people in
Right.
both markets that had, whether they deserved it or not, they had big platforms. I always struggled with that, so I like the scrutiny. I like the thoughtful sort of, like, analysis, Kevin. So I did well with that. I didn't do well where I just thought people were, bloviating because they had a platform to do so.
We need to get the story on video. Did you think Howie Roseman was a complete psychopath when he first started to reach out to you?
I was impressed by his moxie and his relentlessness.
All right, tell the story for people who don't know.
Yeah, Howie reached out to me a lot. He was a law student at Fordham University. He became the finalist for a job that wound up going to somebody else who has actually gone on to have a very good career for themselves, albeit not to the extent from a notoriety standpoint. But this other person actually has multiple Super Bowl rings. I'll just leave it at that. So at the time, he was also reaching out to Joe Banner of the Eagles. And I said to Joe, his name came up in a conversation. I'm like, he's actually a good person. I met with him. I would actually recommend him. He was a finalist for a position, and it was a pretty close decision. And if there was another opening, I would, certainly, strongly consider him. And obviously, as we know, the rest is history, Kevin.
Eagles fans have you to thank. The Eagles have you to thank. You started the whole thing. That's what a wonderful little sliding doors moment there. Jets fans might be upset, but we'll leave that to another day. All right, we're gonna do badasses. It's the most badass person you've ever worked with. Obviously, it would probably be a player, probably be on those Jets teams. The floor is yours, Mike.
Yeah, this one's really easy for me. Damien Woody finished an NFL playoff game with a torn Achilles and played right tackle. And I will never forget, there are just moments in your life, like to win a road playoff game, Kevin, is just absolutely and most indescribable thing. And it was awesome. I'm standing at the front of the locker room. We're in Indianapolis. We beat the Colts, road playoff win. And I will never forget it. I will go to my grave. We had white jerseys on, and there's this massive, like, red Gatorade punch stain on D Wood's, like, front of his jersey. And I got, a suit on, and I'm hugging one guy after the next, totally euphoric. And here's, like, D Wood walking in, like, completely somber. And, like, you see D Wood on TV, he's a big, jovial, happy guy. And, like, we just had a road effing playoff win. And he, and I'll never forget, like, he walked in like totally mundane, and I'm like, what is wrong with you? Like, everyone's going apoplectic, and he was in so much pain, and he was playing literally on one leg, and you could actually watch him play with no Achilles tendon. I don't think there's another feat in North American sports history that is more consequential, more heroic, and defies medical logic than Damien Woody finishing an NFL playoff game at right tackle with no Achilles tendon.
Wow. Damien Woody. Wow. I didn't know. I've met him many times. He's a great guy. I had no idea he was such a badass, to go back to the name of the segment. That's unbelievable. Those Rex Ryan teams felt special. Like, from an outsider, I think I was in college back then watching it, and then obviously ended up watching that year, and then obviously ended up covering the team a little bit, and that's where we first met. But, like, what being on the inside gave those teams that kind of juice, Mike?
So it started with Rex, like a real belief we were the baddest team on the planet. And he really played into it. I mean, there were times he would tell Shoddy, our offensive coordinator, like, we're going to run the ball, tell the other team we're going to run the ball, and then we're going to run the ball. And, like, he actually meant it. And, like, there were times I was in the room, like, he would tell Mike Westhoff, our special teams coach, like, we're not practicing kickoff return because they're not scoring this week. So they're only kicking off once. We're taking it off the script. They have no chance. We are not practicing kickoff return.
Oh my God.
And from every ounce of his soul, Kevin believed it. And so much so, like the players, like, thought he walked on water, and, like, gave them, but he was, like, I'll give you a great story. Like, there was a player somewhat under the radar, Ahmad Carroll, Batman, first round corner for University of Arkansas. Didn't work out on Green Bay. He had a lot of personal fouls. So we get him, and this is the essence of coaching. And this is what pisses me off about the NFL when a coach says, oh, let's move on from him. He can't play, like he's a bust or whatever. This is why Rex Ryan's Rex Ryan. We get Ahmad Carroll, physically as gifted as anybody. That's why he was a first-round pick. What do you like to do, coach? I really like to blitz. Great. That day, Rex Ryan installed the Batman blitz. Ahmad Carroll's nickname was Batman. And not only was he a great blitzer, but what happens is, and this is where like some coaches get it and some just don't. When the 53rd player has a blitz named after him, he's going to give you everything he's got at practice. Now all of a sudden your practices are better because he's bought in, he's more competitive. Like I would say to Kyle Pitts, like, Kyle, we're going to get you the ball in London, right? I want you to come up with the play that you think works best against Jacksonville's defense. And we're going to call it, Gatorade or, something after whatever.
Yeah.
And now Kyle Pitts is like bought in and he has like great ownership. And that's why like Rex was Rex. Like, could I coach Darrelle Revis? Yeah, I could have coached Darrelle Revis. Like, we're going to play man to man, right? Like, that's our call. But his ability to reach guys like Ahmad Carroll is what made Rex really special.
I love this. I love this whole segment here. Is there are there any other called shots Rex had? Like, I love the idea of like him telling Shotty to tell the other team we're running the ball, not covering kickoffs. Like, was this a daily or a weekly occurrence that Rex would be like, all right, this is what we're doing because this is going to happen?
Yeah, and maybe the best one is my line, so I'll give it to you. We were playing the Chargers in a playoff game, and we were the last game on Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
And we're in his locker room, but met with the officials, and so he gets a chance to like speak to the team for like a minute before we go out to play. And the earlier game, the home team was winning, and on Saturday, Kevin, the two home teams had won. I'm like, oh, Rex, this is easy. Just go out there and tell the team, guys, tomorrow's New York Post back page, it's easy. This weekend, 3 home teams and the Jets. Let's go. And that's exactly what he told the team. We beat the Chargers. That's what he said to the team right after the game. And that was the headline the next day. Divisional round of the playoffs, 3 home teams and the Jets.
Mike Tannenbaum, what a closer. Thanks for coming on, buddy. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks so much.